Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 146 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, what kind of a week has it been for you?
It's been a week.
Yeah, I'm going to stop you right there because it's been a week for me too, and specifically a week for the New York Mets. So here's the thing, everybody listening at home. I'm imagining that given the audience we attract, there's not a whole lot of sports fans that listen here, and probably even less Mets fans. But the week that the New York Mets have been on, we record this thing on Monday. A week ago today, we had a doubleheader the day after the season. We had to win one of the games to get in. In the first game, we were losing the whole way. Then we went up, and then we went down, then we went up again, and then it was a nutso game. And then we get into the playoffs. We're playing the Brewers. We get 1-1. It's best of three. We're down 2-0 in the ninth inning against probably the best closer in the National League, Devin Williams.
Sure.
We got one out, and then Big Meat Pete goes up, and he cranks a 3-run dinger, and we win the game, and we move on. And then all of a sudden, we're just getting absolutely lit up for 7 innings against Zach Wheeler and the Phillies in game 1. And then we come back against the bullpen, score 5 runs, 6 runs. And then we do the same thing yesterday, except for then we also gave up the lead in the 9th inning and lost to the Phillies. But it's been 4 incredible games, 3 of which we've won in the last week with the playoffs on the line. Now you guys can hear by the tone of Gavin's that he doesn't actually care about any of this, and that's fine.
No, when New York sports are doing well,
he's happy for
me.
He's going to say he's happy for me.
Yes. Yep. I am happy on behalf of New York, but especially happy on behalf of Mike.
I appreciate that. You know who we're not happy on behalf of? Co-host Fia.
Yeah.
So we called it a segue, Gavin.
Yeah, so Fia...
seamless. Smooth.
Her house from Hurricane Helene was fine, no damage or anything, no real flooding there. Just some cleaning up that needed to be done. But unfortunately, she is in the evacuation zone of Hurricane Milton that should be hitting sometime this evening, the day this episode goes out. Fortunately, she will not be there, so she's going to a conference, so she had to move up her flight. So she is, safe and away from Florida, but hopefully she'll be able to give us a little hurricane update segment to edit somewhere in here about just how she's doing, how, Central Florida's doing and stuff like that. So, thoughts are with Fia and her house, and hopefully it doesn't, flood or blow away or do whatever things do in Florida.
That could be a podcast episode. What do things do in Florida?
Yeah, see, I don't know how much science there would be as much as there would be news clips of Florida man does blank.
You say that like it wouldn't be our most interesting episode.
A little bit of a
no,
segue.
Obviously Fia.
Yeah, go
well,
ahead.
No, I mean, just Fia and anybody else out there, obviously we're thinking of you. Anybody on the East Coast there, particularly the Carolinas from Helene.
Yeah.
Or, this new one, Milton, that looks like it's coming straight for that west coast of Florida. It's looking rough. Just, stay safe. Obviously, you're in our thoughts. And, we hope you guys are back on your feet soon.
Yeah, and there'll be links, just like there were for the sort of little update with us delaying this episode by a week. There'll be links, down below in the show notes for, if you've got some spare change laying around or even just want to share, how people can help. There'll be links down in the show notes for how you can do that. But before we get into too much more of the episode here, and also potentially to give Mike a little time to look up a today in history.
I did.
Okay, it's you never know. Am I wrong to say that?
No, you're 100% correct. But every single time that I already did, I'm going to yell at you for it.
That's fair. But okay. So, a little housekeeping before today in history. Don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on. It really helps, new people find the show. You might not think it does, but really, who knows how algorithms work? So, what does it hurt? But make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram as well. I made an Instagram account, which almost instantly got like flagged for being inappropriate because the title is "I Wish You Were Dead." But rest assured, the bots, the Instagram overlords, released me from Instagram jail, even though I haven't posted anything yet. We do have an Instagram. Digression. Those are the best places to sort of reach us directly. You can also post comments to the episode if you listen on Spotify. That's a handy tool to, sort of talk to us directly. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, make sure to fill out our guest form down below in the show notes as well. And for next episode, I was actually thinking of doing an episode about storms and how they affect their ecosystems, how they affect, what eventually becomes the fossils and rocks left behind. So, that'll be next episode. With that, Mike is our resident high school history teacher. What happened today in history?
So we got a couple pieces of technology for you today.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, in 1936, we have the Hoover Dam begins transmitting electricity to Los Angeles. That's cool.
Yeah.
Given some power to LA. Speaking of power going on in the southwestern United States, in 1941, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt approved the atomic project that would become known as the Manhattan Project.
Huh. Oppenheimer. It's a good movie.
I'm surprised. I'm surprised that was the tone of your huh. I was expecting more of a from you on that one, but I'll take it.
Yeah. I don't know. A lot of good things like nuclear energy with a very large asterisk on that.
I think we've done this before, quickly, but just like real quick, nuclear energy, thumbs up, right? Like we should do more of that stuff.
It's like a thumb 3/4 up.
All right.
Because we still don't really know what to do with the waste. And granted, the amount of waste that's produced has gotten significantly smaller per unit of energy output. But we still have a ton of nuclear waste from the 50s and 60s that we have no idea what to do with. So, but
Well, speaking of things that have gotten significantly smaller, Gavin.
What?
What?
I don't know what that segue was supposed to mean.
No, it's good. Don't worry about it.
Okay. But yeah, today we are talking about the politicization of science. That's a difficult word to say. Fortunately, I don't think I say it all that much throughout the episode. But basically, science policy and how it has been misused and abused by people across the political spectrum here in the United States, particularly in the relatively recent election cycles. We are very close to election season. We are, in fact, in election season.
I've got some news for you, Gavin, about election season nowadays.
Yeah.
It's always election season.
I know. But I looked it up here, and so we are, the day this episode goes out, 27 days away from the election. And in basically every state, there's a couple that haven't yet, but early voting has already started. And voter registration deadlines are coming up quickly, or in a couple of, more than a couple of states have already passed. So I figured I'd take this chance to sort of talk to you about how politics treats science and how that might impact your vote. There will also be links to look up your voter registration status and to register to vote down in the show notes. A lot of states, especially this cycle, have purged their voter rolls. So even if you think you're registered, you may not be. And so make sure to double check using those links below. Unfortunately, though, if you live in Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Ohio, South Carolina, Tennessee, or Texas, the voter registration deadline has already passed. So, sorry to those, what is that, at least 100 million people? And if you're in Missouri, the voter registration deadline is today, the day this episode goes out. So, several others also have their deadlines in the next week. So, please go check your voter registration status. And And like I said, early voting has already started in over 30 states. So the election is already happening. There really is no election day anymore. And personally, just to put this out front, we've never really hidden our political views on this podcast.
Nope.
So, and just for the record, before we get into the rest of this episode, I will be enthusiastically voting for Kamala Harris, despite some very substantial things that I disagree with her on. One of the main drivers of me enthusiastically voting for her is that she helped pass a major science bill with the Biden administration, the Chips and Science Act of 2022. Information on that will be down below because I think they don't get nearly enough credit for that. As well as all the climate change mitigation things in the Inflation Reduction Act. And all of those things are very science positive, in my opinion. However, while those are nice, nice to haves, definitely pros in the pro-con list, the main factor is that the Republican Party writ large in this country has become so thoroughly anti-science that the party as a whole has basically just lost any chance of at least me voting for them for a Republican candidate in the foreseeable future. And that hasn't always been the case for me personally.
Is that true?
So, for reasons that are too complicated to get into with the rest of the stuff here, yes, I think that I could have seen a world where in 2016, if it was between Hillary Clinton and like John Kasich, I could have seen a universe where I voted for John Kasich.
That's a name. I don't know. I wonder how many people remember.
Not many.
The John Kasich 2016 presidential campaign.
He made it to like the last 5, and there was like 20 people running in 2016 on the Republican side. But
he seemed reasonable.
Yeah,
seemed
and like
nice
he
guy.
has since come out and been very like proactive in talking about climate change. John Kasich is the former governor of Ohio, which famously has only slightly more Riz than the state of Ohio. But like I don't know that I would have voted for him, but like I could at least entertain that possibility.
Would have thought about it.
Yeah, it would have been a decision, unlike what it ended up being, where it's like that's not even a choice to me between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and then Biden and Trump, and then this year Kamala and Trump. So
I am curious what your disagreements with Hillary Clinton were, but that's probably well beyond the scope of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Like I said, just a lot of... Yeah, we're not going to get into it. We can talk about that off mic. Yeah, so let's talk about how science is portrayed in U.S. politics. And especially for times before I started paying attention, which is roughly 2015, it's important to look at... One of the best sources that I've found are just national polls. Because before, the last 10 years or so, national polls have been generally quite trustworthy. And that's not to say that they're not useful now, but the data quality just seems to be less reflective of how like elections and things actually turn out than they used to. And feel free to correct me on that if, that doesn't sound quite right to you. But
I'm on board.
So I was really fascinated to look up some of the actual data behind this, because for the entire time I've been paying attention to politics, the Republican Party has been hesitant at best, and outright hostile at worst, to take steps to like slow the effects of climate change, which I think is a pretty like effective proxy for their stances on science as a whole. But it wasn't always that way. There are a bunch of yearly studies that have kept track over the last, over 50 years, of how much people trust science. And it's phrased in different ways, but that's the general gist. It's how much does the general public trust science? And the one that I looked at mostly had data from 1974 to 2010. And it sort of split it up between conservatives, liberals, moderates, the 3 food groups. And in the first year of the poll, 1974, conservatives had slightly higher trust in science. Both both conservatives and liberals were around 50%, slightly below, but conservatives were like half a percentage point higher. And that explained a lot to me, because we've mentioned a couple times, like, surprising things that, like, the Richard Nixon administration did that were cool on the science front.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I see that, I'm like, wow, good on you, Nixon. You did a lot of other really terrible stuff, but on the science-based things, you weren't awful, and in fact did some pretty good stuff. And given this context, that trust in science was, the highest of the three, main political groups that we talk about in this country, that makes more sense. But then, looking at it through time, liberals stayed pretty much constant all the way from 1974 until 2010, only varying by 3% or so up or down. But among conservatives, it fell from, like I said, just about 50% in 74 down to under 40% by 2010. So a drop of, a little over 10 percentage points over that span. And, just given the current state of the Republican Party in this country today, that makes sense. That tracks. And just sort of looking at the graph, and this is, excellent for an audio medium, I know. But the numbers for conservatives dropped a little bit in the Jimmy Carter administration, went back up in the early Reagan years, and then, like most things in this country, got significantly worse the longer Reagan was in office. And never really recovered, much like much of the country. And so there was also a very significant change in rhetoric and how science was talked about in the George W. Bush administration. And that definitely didn't help things. How you talk about something is very important into how people perceive it. For example, if you go to the Wikipedia page for politicization of science, the George Bush administration takes up a very large chunk of it. And so, Mike, you probably understand the Bush presidency much more than I do. So if I miss anything, and we talked a little bit before we started recording, and you think that I did, please chime in.
Well, I mean, the one note I want to make on
Sure.
on that for everybody listening is that both you and I are about the same age. We're in our late 20s now.
Right.
We were alive for the Bush administration. I remember when George W. Bush was president, but I was in 8th grade when George Bush left. I believe you were in 7th grade.
Yeah, I was like 12.
This is for all intents and purposes as actual adults that remember politics. You and I don't remember the George Bush years, so
no. Both
of us are doing a little bit of reading and refreshing ourselves. And like, hey, that's how we learn about history.
Yeah.
None of us remember the Revolutionary War,
right?
And yet, you learn about it and talk about it. But the reason I give that caveat is that there may well be people listening who are not that much older than us that remember these things happening.
Yeah.
A lot better than us, with certain nuances that you and I just can't provide.
Right.
So I do want to give that caveat right away. And I wouldn't say yourself so short, buddy. This is your area of expertise. I just know a touch about politics. So
see, I feel like this is a nice area of where our knowledge bases sort of combine. Being the
knowledge bases and interests.
Yeah. With you being the U.S. history teacher.
Yes.
And granted, I'm sure, who George Bush appointed to be the head of the EPA probably isn't part of the curriculum. But
if it is, then my kids have been misinformed the last number of years. Goodness, I could name his attorney general. I could name his secretaries of state. I'm not sure I can name his EPA director.
Yeah. But these things this is all the stuff about politics that is like boring. Nobody really likes talking about, but these are the things that like make a lot of difference in the day-to-day operations of, especially if you like own a business or pay for gasoline, you know? So, this is like sneakily very important things about how the government works. And to summarize, going back to the George W. Bush administration, he started off the administration by appointing a bunch of lobbyists and industry lawyers to oversee organizations that those people had previously been lobbying against or suing. After, in the later days of the administration, and especially after the administration, transitioned to the Obama administration, personnel from the Surgeon General's office, the Department of Interior, which is the department that handles like the National Park Service, a lot of like federal lands management stuff, the Food and Drug Administration, among several others, alleged that the administration put a lot of pressure on them regularly to change language in their findings to better conform with the political stances of the administration, which is not cool. That's not how those administrations or agencies are supposed to work. If there's just some, pencil pusher scientist in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for anyone who's, not initiated. If there's just some Joe Schmo scientist who publishes their findings, they do work on, how much corn grows under certain conditions or something to that effect. The government shouldn't, in an ideal world, tell that person, hey, your findings say this. They should really say this because that makes me sound better because I already said something about it. That's not how it should work. And so the Bush administration was found culpable of that over and over and over. It was reported that the Bush administration tried to control which government climate scientists could speak to reporters. It would edit testimony that those scientists would give to Congress. There were also, the administration was credibly accused of changing CDC data to make abstinence-based sex education programs look more effective than they were. And it's like, these are the things that, like, yes, these agencies are part of the executive branch. So technically, they do all report to the president. But just like the Department of Justice is supposed to be separately run and independent, all these agencies are also supposed to be that way as well. And, the politicization of the justice system is a completely different topic, but, there's lots of things that the people in the White House should not directly affect. The administration also changed government websites to push a false conspiracy theory that abortions were linked to increased risks of breast cancer. That's something that even I had heard before, but that was there is no evidence for that at all. But they changed data on the government websites to make it look like there was. And I could go on and on about how the Bush 43 administration was terrible and corrupt when it came to science. There was a ton of people that got, investigated, fined, and or resigned due to scandals over things like this in the Bush administration. But unless, Mike, you have anything left to say about the Bush administration, I want to get to the elephant in the room here, no pun intended.
No, I have nothing to say yet. I am going to try and pick my spots.
Okay.
In this one in particular, because I think this is one where both you and I could very easily, go down some rabbit holes that may not be necessary. So I'm gonna hold my tongue.
Okay. Yeah, this could very easily be like a 4-hour episode. But nobody wants that. So, well, there definitely were accusations of certain things, changing of language, in the Obama administration. Like, there definitely were accusations of that. Nothing to the level of the Bush administration. And in the 4 years of the Donald Trump administration, it blew everything that Bush did in his 8 years out of the water. And I think it's really well encapsulated with one particular story from the Trump administration. Because how the administration was so thoroughly anti-science, that could make up an entire podcast, not an entire podcast episode, a whole podcast. And I'm sure there probably is one out there. But I like to sort of encapsulate it in one story, and then we'll break down some of the other details later. So it all goes back to September 2019. So this is not a COVID-related thing even. September 2019, there was a hurricane. And Mike, let me know when you figure out where this is going. Or if you already know.
I think I know exactly where this is going, but at least I'm not sure I do, but I think I do.
So Trump had tweeted that the hurricane was going to hit Alabama. The National Weather Service did not have Alabama on any of their projections for this hurricane, but because Trump tweeted it, the National Weather Service in Alabama got a ton of phone calls from concerned citizens, rightfully asking, hey, is my house about to get hit by a hurricane? Like, do I need to seek shelter? And, the hurricane ended up making landfall and did not impact Alabama at all. Trump held a press conference a few days later and showed a map of the hurricane's path that had been altered very obviously with a black marker to include a bit of Alabama so that Trump could be correct. A few days later, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, they release a lot of weather information, put out a statement saying that Trump was right and that the National Weather Service was wrong. And a later investigation concluded that the head of the Department of Commerce, which, for whatever reason, NOAA is in the Department of Commerce. I don't know. But so the head, NOAA's boss, put pressure on NOAA to put out a statement to make Trump correct. And so, long story short, for the entirety of the Trump administration, if Trump says it, it's true. If the scientific data conflicts with what he says, change the data to make it work. Lying. And undermining nonpartisan institutions like the Weather Service. And so that is, again, because everyone remembers COVID, it's just a very contentious time in this country politically. So I think this highlights it really well. That it's even when the Trump administration was theoretically just chugging along, it wasn't even a midterm year, that they were just doing stuff like this. Where it's he just happened to be wrong once in a tweet, but they can never admit that he's wrong. And so even though there was hard data and all these, fairly accurate weather models saying, no, this hurricane's not going to hit Alabama, they, in the dumbest way possible, with just a literal Sharpie, drew a loop. But the more sinister part is that they pressured a nonpartisan agency into changing their data to make him right. And that's really, from a science perspective, I think all you really need to know about the Trump, the first Trump administration. And it will be even worse in a potential second. Because anybody who might have resisted him the first time is gone. So there's a lot of other things that we'll say about the Trump administration here, but that's the thing that I want you to leave with, is that even when he's wrong about something so stupid, where it's these days you can even just edit tweets, But nope, can't do that. Can't ever admit you're wrong. And so, moving on away from Sharpie Gate, as it was called, because we're brain dead as a society. Moving on from that.
I almost want to fight you on that point, but okay.
Okay, go ahead. That was very just me being facetious. But comparing everything to Watergate, I think downplays how crazy Watergate was.
I mean, I don't know, man.
For the time.
Sure, if we're era adjusting, then okay.
But yeah, calling this Sharpie Gate, I think was just not smart. Anyway, moving on away from the whole hurricane thing. And well, I guess before we do this, so even just with these hurricanes going on, this week and last week, they've just been politicizing the response to it like crazy. Like all the governors who have been impacted by this have been like, no, we're pretty well getting what we need from FEMA. You can always use more disaster relief money, but they've been talking to the president. They've been, getting their needs met, if not immediately, but ending up getting them met. And then there's just people out there lying, saying that the president hasn't talked to these governors at all, that they're only getting, your house was destroyed, hey, here's $750, which is very misleading. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I wish I had your life. But yeah, so you can even see a continuation of this whole hurricane thing going on today. Moving on to just some other stuff across different agencies. So there was a survey taken in 2018. So again, pre-COVID. So this was a survey taken of scientists across 16 different federal agencies that asked if they agree or disagree with the following statement. Quote, "The level of consideration of political interests hindered the ability of your agency to make science-based decisions." Unquote. And overall, 50%...
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. The level of consideration of political interests hindered the ability of your agency to make science-based decisions.
So this is asking agencies and people who work at agencies how much politics and partisanship played a role in the decisions and advice they were rendering.
Yes.
As opposed to just, here's what the science was, have at it.
Basically, it's saying, do you agree that politics has hindered your agency's science-based work? Because it actively asks if it has hindered your work. And overall, 50% of the respondents agreed. So that's across all the agencies. And these include, not just like sort of the quote-unquote hard sciences, geology, biology, chemistry. This includes some like social science stuff as well, and sociology research, stuff like that. But from the Fish and Wildlife Service, 69% agreed that politics hindered their work. From the National... Nice. That's yeah. I mean, not nice, but nice. From the National Park Service, 76% agreed that politics has hindered their work. And from the EPA, the agency in charge of environmental protection, 81% agreed that politics had hindered their work. That's not great.
Nope.
And it's like 50% seems higher than it should be, but at any given time, give or take, half of the federal employees are probably Republicans, half are probably Democrats. I'm sure it skews a bit more Democrat, just where, people with higher educations tend to lean more Democratic. So I'm sure it is skewed, but I'm sure that, the people's own political bias probably plays into that a little bit. But 81% is just insane. And likely a large factor contributing to this feeling of political interference were Donald Trump's political appointments to lead these various agencies. So I mentioned that Bush had named, various lobbyists and industry lawyers and things. Trump really took that up to 11 with some of his appointees. So to name a few, Scott Pruitt, a climate change denier, former lobbyist and attorney.
Pruitt.
Every one of these people just makes me so angry.
So part of the thing was like I think you remember this from the early Trump years, where like everyone was super activated and invested and paid attention to people in government you never used to pay attention to, and like it's like, oh, I remember when I was listening to podcasts about this guy. I remember when I like knew what was going on with Pruitt. And it's was like, anyone taking a bunch of like fancy trips places?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
I mean, pretty much all of them were, realistically.
Well.
But believe it or not, there was a time where the general population didn't know the Secretary of Transportation's name.
Didn't even know they existed.
No. So it's like, it wasn't until they started doing things that are bad, just objectively bad, like objectively corrupt things, that people started paying more attention to these positions. And especially when people started naming, the people to lead these agencies that have a history of doing things that are actively against the mission of that agency. But yeah, back to Scott Pruitt. Climate change denier, former lobbyist, and a former attorney general of Oklahoma, who took many thousands of dollars in campaign contributions from the fossil fuel industry, was appointed to lead the EPA. During his tenure, he advocated for changes in various rules and regulations to let government drain wetlands, which we've talked all about in previous episodes, why those are really important. Change results of reports to omit financial benefits of maintaining wetlands. So any report that talked about, weighing pros and cons of draining wetlands, he would had a standing policy to just be like, play down the benefits. Because, and make sure to emphasize how much not draining them would cost farmers and real estate developers. So very much in the messing with data point of things. Mm-hmm. Moving on, we have Rick Perry. Another one.
I was hoping you were going to bring him up.
Of Dancing with the Stars fame.
I'm hoping you're going to bring up the other thing, though.
If I don't, let me know.
Oh, I would not let you forget.
Yes, Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, who ran for president in 2012. During that campaign, part of his platform was to abolish the Department of Energy.
However,
guess which agency he was appointed to lead? The Department of Energy.
You are forgetting the best part of this,
Okay,
though.
Go ahead.
Which is, at a debate when Rick Perry was running in 2012, there were 3 departments he wanted to abolish, and he could not name the third agency, which was the Department of Energy. So the agency that Rick Perry could not remember that he wanted to abolish was the one he ended up running.
Yep.
Which I always quite enjoyed.
During his tenure, you might have heard some things about this. During his tenure, he ordered that the words climate change, emissions reduction, and Paris Agreement not be used in any official communications. So the Department of Energy could not use the word climate change or emissions reduction. Insane. My personal sleep paralysis, Steven. Ryan Zinke. Current.
Interior?
Yes.
Okay.
And currently the House Representative for the 1st Congressional District of Montana. He is currently in Congress. He was Secretary of the Interior for the Trump administration and often called himself a geologist when he was asked by reporters about, decisions that the Department of Interior made that were not backed by science. He does have a bachelor's degree in geology, but according to his own autobiography, It was picked at random from the university's catalog because he went to the university on I believe, football scholarship.
It's amazing what you can get if you had a football scholarship in this country. Like,
yeah. And he has also never worked as a geologist. And, like, caveat here, you don't need a degree to be a good geologist. You can be a very skilled and talented geologist without one. But the opposite is also true. Just because you have a degree doesn't make you a geologist. Anyway, as Secretary of the Interior, he rescinded a ban on the use of lead bullets and lead fishing tackle on federal lands. So you could just shoot lead bullets off into the distance on federal lands.
So I guess my question is, like, if we are going to allow bullets at all, like nobody has to explain to me why lead is bad, but, like, under the premise that some bullets are okay than others, why are lead bullets particularly worse?
Mostly because, like, other types of bullets are just less toxic, like aluminum or steel. Steel lasts in the environment, just less long. It corrodes a lot faster and then breaks down and can be used by organisms. And it's like, yeah, most organisms need iron to live. At least animals, for sure. And a lot of plants do. To my knowledge, there's nothing that needs lead. So it's like, steel bullets can at least be recycled by the environment given time. Lead, there's really just no there's no upside to this. There's just not.
Okay.
And by this point, lead bullets had been outlawed for, like, not, like, forever, but long enough that, like, most people who buy bullets regularly probably have stopped buying lead bullets. So it's not like, oh, I can finally take out my, hundreds of rounds of lead bullets out hunting. No, that person didn't exist.
Do we know how long they were banned for before?
No, off the top of my head.
Okay.
Let's see what else. Much more famously, this is the thing he was really known for. He reduced the size and use of several national monuments, most notably Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Basically, he reduced the size of them so that the places that were no longer in those national monuments could be opened up for mineral and oil exploration.
This sounds like an end around just to be able to get more mineral and oil, exploration.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
One, I don't remember which one, whether it was Bears Ears. I think it was Bears Ears, but it could have been Grand Staircase as well. But was reduced to, like, easily less than half of its previous size. So it's like, this was just like blatant, hey, mining companies, come. And I'm curious to see if any, how much money he received in his congressional campaign from mining companies. That's a number that I don't have. But he also called for slashing the budget of his own department, including cutting over 4,000 jobs across the department, cutting funding for the United States Geological Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Some geologist, this guy is. That's why I said this guy is and every geologist's sleep paralysis demon. Current congressman. Gotta love it. And lastly, for specifics, because this was not one that I had heard of before doing some of this research. Sonny Perdue, former governor of Georgia, was appointed to lead the Department of Agriculture. During his tenure, he ordered all publications by department scientists to include a disclaimer that said all of their findings were preliminary and didn't reflect department policy. And so the second one,
Wait.
I kind of get.
Really?
Where it's like saying, hey, this one paper is not reflective of the department as a whole. I'm okay with that, personally. I don't work in the department, so it's maybe that doesn't fly so well. I don't know.
I would guess I'd quibble with the wording. Like,
that's fair.
Like, because it would make me think the department does not stand behind the work that they are doing.
That's fair.
As opposed to a distinction between, yes, like, it is possible to have like minority evidence for something, and yet the conclusion the department draws is
right.
Different from any particular study. But
right.
Oh, maybe that's just a semantics issue.
Yeah. The one that really got me was that the findings were preliminary, because it's like if you're publishing it in a journal, presumably you are beyond preliminary findings at this point. Preliminary findings are things that you present at conferences and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that, again, just either way, just a directive from the top of the agency to say, hey, you must include these two statements that somewhat downplay your findings, regardless of what they are. Also, during his tenure, the Department of Agriculture moved the headquarters of two of its main science-based agencies from D.C. to the Kansas City area. Which might sound kind of, relatively innocent. However, this resulted in 2/3 of the workers who got reassigned to quit. Because they didn't want to leave. And so they knew that before, I'm sure they did sampling and was like, hey, if we do this, who's coming with us? And this was just a way to clear out these workers who, were career scientists in these agencies, non-political figures. Some divisions of those agencies lost over 90% of their staff. Mostly revolving around climate change, food security, and rural economics.
And I could make the case and have, softly made the case before that we do not need as much of the federal government located in Washington, D.C. as currently exists. And in fact, it is probably to the detriment of the federal government as a whole. That having been said, it sounds as though, just the way you're describing it here, like this was done not with the purpose of making things more efficient or trying to have some regional balance, but the goal was to have people resign and have the department be able to do less work.
Based on what I read, that very much seems like that was the case.
Okay.
Because it wasn't, the whole agency. It was select agencies focusing, like I said, on these things like climate change. And climate change, I get that that's like a political thing for them. I get that. I strongly disagree with the motive, but I understand the logic of why they did it. But things like food security and rural economics, those are your political base. So
at least part of it.
Right. And so I just fundamentally don't understand why they would do this unless to clear out these people. And I could go on about tons of other political appointees. Also, fun fact, every single one of those guys was investigated, fined for various misappropriations of funds, retaliatory labor practices, violations of various federal laws, like the Hatch Act, which shouldn't even, I think it should exist, but realistically just doesn't exist. So the Hatch Act prevents government employees from campaigning in their official capacity. So that's why, whenever you watch something with, Pete Buttigieg, for example.
He's very clear about this.
He's very clear. He's like, I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my capacity as transportation secretary. And that's literally how easy it is to not violate the Hatch Act, but it gets violated so much. It's so stupid.
And to be clear, there are violations on both sides of the aisle.
Yes, yeah.
What the Trump administration was a lot more flagrant about flouting it and basically doing the what are you going to do about it?
Right, because the Hatch Act also applies to the president, which is why you don't see Kamala Harris campaigning from the Rose Garden.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that the Hatch Act applies to the president and vice president. Let's look that.
Yeah, let's look that up.
Yep. So it applies to the executive branch of the federal government, except the president and vice president, because the president and vice president, like they are always. It is
hard to get away from that one.
Right. It kind of wouldn't make sense to try and prevent the president and vice president from engaging in political activity while doing their job, because their job is inherently political.
That's fair. Yeah, I think they just try to honor the spirit of the law, which is why you don't see a ton of campaign stuff from like the Rose Garden all that often. Obviously, it's
right. There are some rules and norms and like some respect for the office that takes place, but that's a separate conversation from the law.
Right. And then, looking at how long we're at, and then there's all the COVID stuff, which it was 4 years ago. I memory hold a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Because this was a very rough time in my life. Besides the fact that I met my wonderful wife in 2020, the early days of COVID were real bad for Gavin. But here, I'm not going to even come close to discussing everything that the Trump administration and Trump himself did during his administration that disregarded and interfered with science around COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And up front, I am all for giving credit where credit is due. Operation Warp Speed, which was the program that developed the COVID vaccine so quickly, was an objective success. Most projections said that it would be easily over 18 months before a reliable, safe vaccine was developed for COVID-19. And Operation Warp Speed got it done in less than a year, which is an absolute success and an incredible achievement and one of the best examples of, private sector and government scientists working together and helping people, which is what government at the end of the day is for. And also, just full transparency, I want to be clear that there was a bit of scientific interference around Operation Warp Speed in the early days of the Biden administration. Yeah, so Warp Speed was one of the few things in early 2020 or 2021 that were positively associated with the Trump administration. And the Biden administration issued orders to the people in charge of it to change the name of the project and to stop using the term warp speed in all of their communications. So they said, "Hey,
seems like unnecessary."
Right. Where it's like, this is, especially early 2020, this is in the months immediately, or 2021, in the months immediately following January 6th. So this was one of the few things that Trump was positively associated with, broadly at the time. And so the Biden administration was like, let's not call it that anymore. So, again, full transparency. Nobody's hands are completely clean in, kind of meddling around with science. And so this is not Trump levels of interference, but still a bit shady, in my opinion. Back to Trump, though. Before COVID happened, in 2018, the administration disbanded a task force focused on readiness for global pandemics. Because
that is funny.
Yeah, in hindsight, and they did it.
Like, if you can't laugh at stuff like that, I'm not sure what you can laugh at. Like obviously it's horrible and awful and people died and everything, but also, little on the nose.
Right, and it's like, this was something that the Obama administration sort of really helped gear up after all the stuff with Ebola. Because Ebola, I remember, I think this was when I was in, high school, it was a little scary. Just because it was, a strange disease that none of us had ever heard of before, coming from a part of the world that, frankly, most of the U.S. looks down on. And
H1N was also a good catalyst for a lot of this stuff, too.
Yeah, that's true. But so this was something that the Obama administration spun up in sort of the later-ish days of the Obama administration. And because it had Obama's name on it, the Trump administration got rid of it. And it was as simple as that. Moving on to 2020 now, so during the COVID days, at a campaign rally in 2020, Trump said out loud that he told his administration to slow down testing for COVID to make the numbers of reported infections go down. And later, he was asked by reporters if he was kidding or joking during that statement, since that's often, his line, or at least the line of his surrogates. It's like, oh, he didn't mean that. Oh, he was joking. So he was asked if he was joking, and he said, quote, "I don't kid." So just blatantly saying, hey, if we test fewer people, there will be fewer cases of COVID. And that means we can open things back up again, which will make my re-election campaign look better.
I mean...
And that basically became the administration's entire plan for the pandemic. Test fewer people so that the number of confirmed cases looked lower, which would cause less of a freakout also in the stock market as well. The administration, also still around, testing of different things. The administration ordered testing of many different drugs to see if they might be helpful in fighting infections or reducing symptoms, which objectively was the right thing to do. It was a new disease. We hadn't even tested its, genetic cousins all that much to see what medicines could help with them. So this was, a correct thing to do. It's just throw everything at the wall because people are dying by the tens of thousands, and just see what helps even a little. And among those drugs tested were the anti-malaria drugs chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. You may have heard of them. The FDA gave emergency use authorization to test those drugs on certain hospitalized patients. So not just for anybody, for people who are basically dying in the hospital of COVID. That was the only authorization the FDA gave. The administration, however, overruled that and said this can be used not only on hospitalized patients, but had it sent out to pharmacies in about a dozen states. That was in April 2020. So again, still throwing stuff at the wall and overruling FDA. By June, data had come back showing that these drugs had no impact on COVID, but Trump had been touting them in a lot of rallies and other media appearances, and he couldn't be wrong. So even after the FDA withdrew its emergency use authorization, he and several other administration officials continued to talk about them as miracle cures for COVID. And I tried to find even really rough estimates for how many people were negatively impacted by chloroquine, and it's basically impossible to tell. But
I mean, what are some of the negative side effects?
It's not that they had negative side effects. It's that the administration was telling people, hey, if you have COVID, take this drug, you'll be fine. And really, it does nothing. So how many of those people took this drug? It did nothing, but because they had such confidence in dear leader that they didn't go to the hospital in time and died. Or, were sicker for longer than they would have been otherwise with other medicines and, now have a permanent disability.
So I guess the only little nugget that I would want to throw at the other side is best as I can tell, and from what I've heard and seen, being willing to try hydroxychloroquine or anything, in those early days of the pandemic, fine, throw something against the wall, and we'll write up the study and we'll see what happens if you want to be the guinea pig for something. It was the confidence with which people were talking about hydroxychloroquine.
Right.
With no evidence to back it up. Like, the actual attempt to use, like...
Right, I totally agree that, like, the FDA was like, you know what? Sure. These random drugs, and, it's not like they just did this, emergency authorization with these 2 drugs. They did it with hundreds of drugs, which was the right thing to do, because we had no idea what would work and what wouldn't.
Right.
But when the data came back, that clearly showed these do nothing. It's basically like giving people a car to drive and telling them that the airbags are all good to go when you know that they're not.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to being like, hey, you bought it, it's on you, but it's on you.
Right. And this was, I don't really go into ivermectin here, but similar deal, where it's like, that actually does have some negative side effects. Yeah, where it's like they were just touting it so much, and it's like, how many people, had such confidence because they were saying it so confidently that these things would cure your COVID, and then a week later, you're still not able to climb stairs, and by the time you're able to get to a hospital and get put on a ventilator, it's too late. Like I said, I couldn't find numbers for how many people that happened to, but it's certainly higher than 0. Which is too much.
Mm-hmm.
In the lead up to the Republican National Convention in 2020, he pressured the head of the National Institutes of Health to approve a new treatment method that was still under review, that was, showing some promising results, but was still under review for safety. Trump wanted it approved by the time the convention started, so it would help him politically, but the research wasn't done yet. So, did Trump wait for the data to come in, which would have been appropriate? No, of course not. Instead, on the day before the convention started, he just tweeted that the FDA had given the treatment emergency use authorization when it had not yet, and overstated its actual effectiveness. The FDA would later approve this drug for use, but in a much narrower scope than Trump had announced. So he just said, hey, FDA, I'm making this call for you. Don't worry about it. And quite a bit ahead of time from what the FDA actually did. When discussing reopening things across the country, there really is no objectively correct way that things could have gone. And, I do sympathize with the Trump administration for that. Whether it was always going to be both too early and too late, depending on what part of society you're looking at,
Right.
And so, while there was no objectively right answer, there sure were a lot of wrong answers. One very influential advisor to Trump was named Scott Atlas. If you've heard of him, I'm so sorry that you live the life that you live.
I have no idea who this guy is.
I'm so happy for you. Because his name gave me Vietnam flashbacks, because I did recognize the name, and I hate myself for it. So this guy, he advocated for basically just letting it rip through the population to build herd immunity, which is a phrase that I'm sure most people heard during 2020.
Heard.
This was very stupid at the time, and now looks even more stupid with the benefit of a few years more research into COVID, because each time you get it, it messes with your circulatory system in different ways.
Oh,
especially
really?
with the different variants. Yeah, it is not like the flu, where it's like, the flu just kind of messes with your lungs and stuff. COVID's not a respiratory disease. It's a circulatory disease. And it messes with a lot of your blood vessels in different parts of the body in really different ways. That's part of, the whole brain fog thing with COVID. That's because your brain is just getting, marginally less oxygen. But yeah. And so it just messes with you more and more each time, and has left thousands of people with permanent disabilities, and likely more than that, with just general decreased functioning in their life. And again, even if that's like very marginal, I'm thinking like large economic scale. If this makes society as a whole 1% less productive, that's going to throw a couple wrenches into the economy. If people take 1% more sick days.
Yes.
That could mean a lot of things going forward for the next years in the economy. And I'm sure economists 100 years in the future are going to study the decades after the pandemic and see some really interesting economic trends, because this has been a mass disabling event all across the world. And so that guy who advocated for just open up everything in like April, May 2020 and just let it rip, let everybody get sick all at once, and then we'll be fine. By October 2020, that guy was in charge of the COVID task force, overseeing people like Anthony Fauci. And basically,
to be clear, there were a lot of people that were arguing for the same thing, but having them in positions of power loudly saying things like this is a choice.
Yeah. And so by this point, he was basically just doing whatever Trump said over the objections of the researchers. I could go on, but you get the point here. And so for this last little bit, I'm going to go back to some public polling, because I love a good poll. Pew Research, which is a very prominent polling group, asked over 8,800 U.S. adults whether science had, quote, a mostly positive impact on society. So basically just, is science good for society overall? In January...
You think this would be an easy one?
Right. In January 2019, so pre-COVID, both Republicans and Democrats were above 70% on that question. Good. We love to see it. However, as of October 2023, 69% of Democrats agreed. So, a bit lower. But only 47% of Republicans, less than half, agreed that science has been mostly positive for society. Unsurprisingly...
that's a wild number.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you sat down and explained like all the things science has gotten, like, central air conditioning and you're like, and just made it that broad, they would be different. But it says a lot about what people think about science.
Tuberculosis. Polio.
Those are the big things, but like your everyday life, is just surrounded by, small, in some cases, big scientific advancements. But where people's heads must be at when they were answering that question, that's scary, and that's a hole, that's not a hole that cannot be climbed out from, but
yeah,
I worry.
Yeah. Well, if you're worried, just wait for this next thing. So this is the sort of the last segment I have for us here today. Lastly, this is something that's only, it is very deeply connected to the upcoming election, but not directly. And that's the Supreme Court. During his 4 years as president, Donald Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. For context, in his 8 years in office, Obama appointed 2. And Biden has only appointed
3.
1. What?
Obama appointed 3. However.
Well, yes.
Or I guess he nominated 3.
Yes. One of them, if Republicans were logically consistent, he should have had... either he should have had 1 more, or Trump should have had 1 less. But...
yeah.
But yeah, so Obama appointed 2, and Biden has appointed 1. So over 12 years of Democratic presidencies, they have appointed the same amount of Supreme Court justices as Trump did in his 4. if Trump is elected again in November, he's poised to be able to appoint at least 2 more justices, as Justices Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito are in their mid-70s. And especially if Trump is elected, they're going to retire. Because they want to retire when there's a Republican president so that they can be replaced by, conservative judges as well.
Mm-hmm.
If that happens, Trump himself will have appointed a majority of the Supreme Court, which to my knowledge has never happened before in U.S. history.
Franklin Roosevelt did that. Franklin Roosevelt did that, and obviously George Washington.
Well, yes, okay.
In the first one, but yeah, Franklin Roosevelt, I believe, had appointed 8 or possibly all 9, but I think just 8 members of the court. He was also there for ever
in extra term.
Yes, an extra term in a couple months
and some change.
Yes, right, and there was a number of strange things going on around that time,
right?
But in call it post-war America.
Right, in essentially modern America.
Right.
Which is just insane. Like I said, most presidents get 2 if they're lucky. Trump got 3 in 1 term. And potentially could have 5. And so the judges that he has appointed, the 3, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett, have been bananas terrible for science policy in this country. Just this past term, so in the last 6 months, the 3 Trump-appointed judges, along with the other Republican appointees to the court, gutted the ability for all of these government agencies we've been talking about, EPA, FDA, Park Service, Agriculture, basically gutted their ability to make regulations. So basically, the EPA can't really regulate air and water quality with any enforceable power. The FDA can't really regulate food and safety of drugs, or safety of food and medicines and drugs with any enforceable power. Department of Agriculture can't regulate food safety with any enforceable power. Department of Energy can't regulate power plant emissions and safety, among thousands of other examples. Instead, what they did is they've decided that Congress, with all of its infinite wisdom, should be the ones to make these regulations, which is problematic for a few reasons. Firstly, if there's one thing that basically every person in this country can agree on, it's that Congress does not work currently.
And it certainly doesn't work fast enough.
Right. And it has been stuck like this for the entire time I've been paying attention to politics, so at least give or take 10 years, and probably longer than that. And then second, this is my opinion here, even if Congress was functional, they're not experts, and nor should we expect them to be, on everything that could possibly be regulated by the federal government. They don't know what's a safe level of lead in soil. They don't know how to properly treat food on an industrial scale to make it safe. And like I said, we shouldn't expect them to be experts in those things. That's not why we elect people. You could argue that it should be, but that's just not reality. And so, basically, this one Supreme Court decision removed the enforcement power from all of these federal agencies, and that has been a long-standing goal for conservatives in this country for decades. And that is why Trump appointed all these people, all those people to those science-based agencies during his term, those Scott Pruitts, Ryan Zinke's, etc., to make them less able to do their jobs based on evidence. And instead, just allow big business to do kind of whatever they want, while providing campaign contributions to those folks as thank yous. That, especially the deregulation, just making those federal agencies not functional, that has been an explicit goal of conservatives for decades.
And one of the reasons why being able to turn a lot of that regulation over to theoretically Congress, however more practically the courts, has been a goal.
That's really what it's going to come down to, yeah.
Well, right, is conservative activists for a couple of decades now have been very effective at getting much more ideological people as members of the federal court. And that's not just the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But that is members of United States district and circuit courts. And so when you take the authority away from the executive branch, and the legislative branch probably will not act in any kind of a responsible way and speedy enough way to do things, you are left with the judicial branch, which has been kind of primed now for a couple of decades to be very hostile to a lot of the regulation that that folks like you and me and probably a lot of the people listening would probably deem as necessary, and in keeping with the laws that were passed, but not keeping within the ideology of the conservative activists that made that ruling and many others like it possible.
Yeah. And
if you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend looking up the Federalist Society.
Yes.
And what's the guy? His last name is Leo.
Leonard Leo.
Thank you, Leonard Leo.
One of the worst people on the planet.
But like one of the most effective. Like this,
he is extremely effective at what he does.
Right. It might sound like damning with faint praise, but he is incredibly effective at what he does, and his multi-decade long playing the long game view of the federal courts has proven wildly successful. I would argue very much to the detriment of American politics and the scientific community and a number of other things.
Yeah.
But it is the reality that we live under and are about to see more and more of the depths of, as the decision you're talking about, getting rid of something called Chevron deference.
Yes.
Just starts to become part of American life.
Yeah, and one of the main ways that this happened, why this sort of shift in, like I said, not just the federal or the Supreme Court, but federal courts all across the country, whether it's circuit of appeals courts or just various district courts, is because of the way the Senate works. Is that when the president nominates a judge to fill a vacancy, somebody retires or somebody dies or moves up a rung on the judicial ladder, the president needs to nominate that person to then get approved by the Senate. And throughout Obama's presidency, the Senate, especially in the latter half, was controlled by Republicans, namely Mitch McConnell, the senior senator from Kentucky. And he basically just said, no, I'm not even going to let the Senate vote on these nominations. So he just held all of these seats open so that when Donald Trump got elected president, he just flooded the courts with conservative judges. Which is really just not how, I'm sure if you explain the situation to Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, they probably said, no, that's probably not how I want that to work. Speculating, but
yeah.
Anyway, all of that to say, between the various ways that Republicans in general and Trump's orbit in particular have become so anti-science and anti-expert in general, and the future of the Supreme Court, I am very enthusiastically voting for Kamala Harris in November, and I think you should too. So if you have, friends, family members, whoever, that are on the fence, not quite sure, but that think science is important, please send them this episode. It is really important because, even just looking at science funding over the years, funding for anything that's not bombs has
decreased
dramatically under all administrations, frankly. And that is bad. I think we should want to be a society that likes science for reasons other than bombs. And, you know, when I was doing a lot of research, a lot of things for this episode, a lot of things came up about the 60s and how excited people were about science and how much in the 50s, you know, leading up to the 60s and the Apollo project, how heavily the government invested in science and science education. And I think we're really missing a big opportunity to do that same thing again here with things like AI and just so many other different emerging fields in science. And I think it's going to be a big detriment to this country in the future if not to... I hate everyone boogeymanning China, but China and its authoritarian government doing a lot of messy stuff with AI when we're not also doing some things with AI just kind of sits wrong with me. I don't know. Long, rambly end to the episode here, but that's what I got.
Yeah, so one thing that got me, and Gavin, you know this, I was a lot more disaffected when I was younger in politics.
Yeah.
And, you know, was unwilling to vote for the lesser of two evils kind of deal. And, like, I wish I could have gone back and been like, man, voting for the lesser of two evils is a whole lot better than the alternative. I will vote for the lesser of two evils as long as it takes. And, like, I know that's not exactly a winning argument, but...
right, and this,
I imagine
this is
most people...
This is not a politics podcast where I have very in-depth thoughts about third parties, and I think they should be really good, but people go about them terribly. You don't start building momentum for a third party by electing somebody president.
And I disagree.
Okay, and well, that would be a future episode then.
Not with the president part, but the whether or not third party should be big and good in America.
Oh,
under the current system, they can't be, but that is a much different episode.
Yes.
Than what we currently have here. But I think we're ready to wrap it up. I think that this has certainly gone on long enough. I think everybody gets the point of what we're trying to say. You know, this stuff is important and it should not be political, but you know, we will play the hand that we're dealt when it comes to, you know, playing the politics game. This has been episode 146 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that was Gavin. We hope to have Fia back in a couple weeks, but until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.